Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. It is Monday, August 30th. I'm Rob Fowler, the CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan, and Brian Calley, our president, is co-host. And just want to express our appreciation to the underwriter for this briefing, which is Marana Group. Marana Group is a data, documents, and distribution solutions company in Portage, Michigan. And if you'd like to find out more about them, they are at moranagroup.com. Brian, I want to kind of start with what seems like a symbolic backstep in kind of small business opening and remaining open, which is McDonald's. I was talking about closing indoor dining really nationwide, or at least in areas with high Delta virus transmission. What do you make of that?
Well, a couple of things that I would mention. First is that corporate has said to some of their franchises that they need to close indoor dining, and here's how you do it, but not nationwide. But in that same communication, they have said that they're considering what their nationwide policy ought to be. So the idea of closing indoor dining on its surface, yeah, it's a step backward, and it's just an individual company deciding what to do. But I do suspect that a decision like that this year is a lot more straightforward than it was last year. So first of all, fast food knows that they can operate and still make money with their dining rooms closed, and maybe even make more money that way, especially when you consider that staffing levels are pretty challenging right now. So if you think they don't have to have people cleaning the restrooms all the time and in the sit down dining areas as much, perhaps that has factored into this decision, not just the spread of the virus, but ultimately, you hate to see any steps backward like that. We've seen a lot of action, a lot of controversy on things like vaccine policy and that sort of thing, but it's not like opening and closing things. This just closing indoor dining for a private sector company to make that decision, it does feel significant.
All right. Well, it is. We've taken to calling it Data Monday, and maybe just as a reminder for everyone, part of the reason we really track the data, what's going on across the country and across the world, is it gives us a view as to what our policymakers are seeing, and really potentially what is the policy implication of a spike or a drop off. And so we'll dive into the data a little bit again today and see what's happening across the country and across the world.
All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and just jump right in here. First, we'll look at the global numbers, and you see that there are some waves, and there's one that's kind of crested and started to come down, largely driven by the United States, actually, in this particular case. But I always want to put an asterisk on that our overall testing and healthcare system and identifying COVID cases is far superior to the vast majority of the world. So I don't imagine that this is actually very representative, but these are reported cases. If you look at, though, each of the regions around the world, you'll see that the red one here is the United States, and you see that starting to level off a little bit. We'll take a closer look at that, which is as you pull out here that across the United States, the increase in cases continues to slow, and that's a good sign, considering that some places in the United States right now that have some pretty serious hospitalization capacity issues. So looking at the regions around the country, you'll notice here the South, where you're kind of hearing everything in the news, that it has leveled off. So in some places in the South, it started to come down. This year, Florida is the one, or this week, Florida is the one that is featured here. As you see, it kind of spiked up and then is moderated and flattened out a little bit. The other regions around the country all look very moderate compared to the South, but I just point out that the Midwest here is still that's the sharpest increase at the moment. But that's not Michigan's part of the Midwest, but Michigan's numbers look better than that. Hospitalization nationwide, you'll see second highest that it's been over the course of the pandemic. And but again, starting to slow down in terms of new admissions. Slowing down doesn't necessarily, I mean, that means that better times are ahead usually, but it doesn't mean things are getting any easier. So there are a lot of the hospitals that are struggling right now are really in emergency type conditions. And then nationwide, you see deaths that are rising, but looks like they're starting to slow down a little bit too. No surprise, given that hospitalizations have finally started to slow, but also no surprise that that it's a lot lower than it was in the past pre-vaccine days. Looking at Michigan, you'll see that this is a much more moderate looking increase than a lot of the rest of the country. And it's starting to give a little bit of credence to the idea that some epidemiologists have talked about in recent weeks, is that, Michigan had this unique in the nation wave of infections that was really recent compared to others. And the idea that maybe our population has higher natural immunity in addition to the vaccine immunity. And from that spring wave that was really very, very unique in America. So this has been now going up since really the second and third week in July. Now remember, these Delta waves, typically they go up fast and they come down pretty fast. So usually you see the increases go anywhere from 4 to 7 weeks before they start coming down. And really, I mean, I don't know where Michigan's not going up that much. Does that mean that it will come down slower too, or that it'll keep on going up? It's a bit of an enigma. Looking at the hospitalization, naturally, you see the hospitalization wave looks a lot slower than previous increases. And that has a lot to do with the fact that the infection wave is a lot slower now too. And then deaths, thankfully, even more so. It would be really nice to see our results turn out like the UK or in Great Britain, where they really have completely separated out deaths from infections. I think that's really ultimately what the goal would be in the intermediate term. So we see in Ohio, our neighbor to the south, we haven't looked at Ohio in a little while. Ohio is a good example, though, what we see happening in the Midwest. Remember that Midwest region that was going up a little more sharply, and you see here that Ohio is going up more sharply than Michigan, but it has been now for a good 3 to 4 weeks, but I guess especially 3 weeks. So maybe by the 4th or 5th week they hit the crest and come back down. That's the pattern that we've seen around the globe. You see the hospitalizations look almost identical to the infection wave, but their deaths remain pretty low. And so again, good sign that and Ohio's made some really good progress with vaccines. They've pretty similar to where Michigan is at. Let's take a quick look at Florida here. And Florida is they had this one area where it spiked up really a lot higher and then settled right back down. And it looked like it's flattened out, hasn't really started to come down except for this one little peak that looks like kind of a data anomaly. But really this is, the wave would normally kind of crest over before it starts coming down. And that's where they're at. And thankfully, that's where they're at because their hospitalizations are at all-time highs right now. But what tells me that the infection wave is on the way down for real is that the hospitalizations actually slowed, crested, and have started to come down a little bit. So regardless of whether you catch everything in testing, people show up to hospitals either way. And but the fatalities are up as high as they've ever been in Florida, higher than they've ever been in Florida right now. And the Delta variant is much more contagious. So it's getting to people that it didn't get to before. With even though Florida has done a great job on vaccinations, the most vulnerable population, even though the vast majority of them are vaccinated, there's still 800,000 people that aren't. And so that can easily overwhelm a hospital system if you have a more contagious variant that maybe before people could dodge and couldn't dodge it as well this time. with the hurricane and power outages hitting Louisiana, thankfully the storm has been reclassified as a tropical storm as opposed to a hurricane now, but still they've got lots of problems they have to deal with power outages and getting power restored. They're also contending with the highest case levels that they've had during the entire pandemic in Louisiana right now. They're also contending with the highest hospitalization rates, although it does look like they're starting to come down. But again, I want to point out that for hospitals, when they're still up in this area, they're still operating in crisis every day. The fact that they're coming down means it's not getting worse, but it has to come down quite a bit before they're out of that kind of crisis operation. And then deaths are also at about all-time highs for Louisiana. United Kingdom, this is kind of a strange occurrence, but not unlike something they experienced in the past, where there was a peak, it went down, and then it's back on the rise again. But still, they seem very determined to continue with the same type of approach of increasing vaccinations, but not doing the lockdowns that had been part of the strategy in the past. And the reason I think that they're very confident in that is this chart right here. So you see that they've had the number of deaths per day had reached about 1,250 at their peak earlier this year. And this time, even though you see infection peak, which is not as high as before, but pretty close, and yet they've totally separated out the death experience from infections. So this really is, I think, a standard for everybody to shoot for. I wanted to point out one thing about Israel. Now, Israel is contending with an increase right now, a pretty big increase, and they've also had a change in prime ministers this year. And so the prime minister before, who had was internationally acclaimed for the success in rolling out the vaccine. Of course, the new prime minister doesn't want to underperform, but also they have been determined in saying that we are not going to take the same approach in closing things down as before, doing the lock-ins, but instead they're taking an approach of testing. And the United States, as you can see, doesn't test anywhere near as much as Israel, but that's an approach that to kind of test their way out of it. They test enough people, identify all the cases, people change their behavior when they know they're positive, usually. And so that's an approach that I'm going to keep an eye on this wave that they're experiencing and see whether or not it looks any different than anywhere else, based on their desire to identify as many cases as possible and to rely on just people changing their behavior on their own because they know they're positive, as opposed to trying to enforce regulations to make people behave differently. Oh, you're on mute there, Rob.
Sorry about that. You'd think I know that by this point. Let's stick with Israel for a minute. There was a study about natural immunity that came out of Israel. They've been one of the leaders from the beginning, so they've got more time to study the impact. I thought it was interesting the sort of strength of natural immunity, or those who've had the disease now have that natural immunity.
Yeah, and I always feel like I kind of have to qualify these talks when we talk about natural immunity and vaccinations, and that it's become pretty politicized. But here's the thing is, so this study from Israel shows that having had the virus provides a lot of protection from reinfection. So natural antibodies that your body makes after an infection are highly effective. This is good news. For whatever reason, there's some kind of resistance sometimes from the idea of like people have a hard time accepting that the body can produce antibodies that are effective. That's the way that the immune system works. Now, the policy question on whether that's, do you have an antibody test instead of a vaccination and that kind of thing? Sure, that's a policy argument that people are going to continue to have. But the fact that there was a a pretty robust study coming out of Israel that shows that natural immunity is very effective, maybe even more effective, at least in a short term, than a vaccine. But here's the thing: the vaccine protects people from serious illness and death. So getting the virus is not a good strategy. The authors of the study were really, really forceful in trying to make this point that don't try this at home type of a message, that it's not worth getting the virus naturally and having a much higher chance of serious illness or death compared to what you'd face with the vaccine. And here's the other thing that the study showed was that having a previous infection and the vaccine was the best protection overall. So it showed that the vaccines are effective, having been previously infected is effective, and if you had both, that it was the most effective in terms of preventing you from getting infection in the future.
So we have been pretty clear that we're encouraging people to get vaccinations, and not to fight with those who are absolutely dead set against it, but certainly to those who are open-minded about it and want to just become more educated about it. And the reason we do that is because it matters to small business lockdowns, small business closures. It's the public policy response that we're concerned about. So we've been a part of an overall messaging campaign, and I just want to mention that there is a toolkit that we're making available to employers about how one may talk to their employees about vaccinations.
Yeah, this is a toolkit meant to give employers who want to talk to their employees, but don't know how to start that conversation, open that conversation, or what's the information that we can rely on to share it. And while when we first kind of opened the door to this type of messaging, it was the idea that we wanted to keep epidemic emergency powers of the governor at bay. But it's also, I think, a pretty logical strategy in a time when workforce shortages are so acute that you really can't afford to have people out, and so the strategy of workforce that is mostly vaccinated is more more immune to being out or quarantined or isolated because of infections or exposures in the future.
All right, sticking with vaccinations. It's interesting, we're at a time where the Pfizer vaccine has had full FDA approval, and that was an important milestone for even some employers who have a vaccine mandate. It didn't take effect until after the FDA approved something. And so we're at this interesting point. FDA has approved the Pfizer, but not the Moderna or the Johnson & Johnson with full and final approval.
Yeah, so all three have emergency approval. Pfizer was the first to submit, and therefore the first to receive the regular full-fledged approval by the FDA. The Moderna vaccine was submitted for full approval about 30 days after Pfizer did. So presumably about 30 days later, if they had the same type of a process, then you would see the final approval on Moderna. I've read that Johnson & Johnson is readying a request for full approval, but that it hasn't been requested yet. You know, I do have to wonder with Johnson & Johnson, it's the least popular of the options, and whether or not they're juggling a business decision on, going for final approval is expensive. It's quite a process. Is it really worth it doing that, since then people are, the marketplace is really moving in a different direction. So that'll be interesting to see. Apparently they're getting ready to submit for that approval. We'll see if they do.
And again, let's stay on this for a second. The other sort of, I guess in this case, population of those for whom a vaccination has not been approved is under 12-year-olds. And there's been some speculation that that's a population that will get approval here before long as well.
Yeah, there was some thought that maybe it would happen in the fall, but over this past weekend and late last week, there were some shifting expectations there. that it wouldn't be that soon. It would more be late fall or early winter. I've seen different reports on whether it would be ages 5 to 12, in some cases maybe 2 to 12. But so I don't have a good read yet on exactly what's likely to get approved, but I saw nothing that gave me the impression that there wasn't an approval forthcoming. I think that they were trying to reset expectations on timing. There was a time when there was, and keep in mind that we're talking about emergency approval for adolescents. The approval for adults there was an emergency approval, and then they gave full approval later on. Right now, there is no approval for those under 12. It would be an emergency use approval first and then full approval at some point after that. And as we've seen, it takes a while to go through that whole process. So probably, based on a couple of articles and the quotes in the articles from the federal officials, looking like December's probably a more likely time period than fall.
All right. So if this were Jeopardy, the category would be things that are ending. Things that are ending. Let's start with the pandemic unemployment insurance, additional $300 a week, scheduled to end September 4th.
This is a really, really big deal. So this is the final and last period of time that unemployment, the federal increase to the state's unemployment system can be in effect. So this is when the feds say it ends, and the state will have kind of rode it out to the very end. There are neighborhood 400,000 to 500,000 people that will presumably exit the system at that point, or at least they'll lose the federal portion of the unemployment insurance. So that's a big amount of people that will be kind of pushed or nudged back into the workforce. I do have some concerns that employers should temper their expectations about this being an immediate solution. I mean, there are a lot of habits that form at a period of time, like getting used to working 40 hours a week or more, or even if it's less. I think it makes sense to just anticipate that that there's a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people that are used to reporting to work again every day. So I think that this will help. It'll make a difference, but I think it might be a little bit bumpy on a case-by-case basis.
Another thing that is ending is if you remember, the Families First Coronavirus Act required companies under 500 to offer family and medical leave. Then it was extended not to require it, but to offer a tax credit. There was a tax credit in both cases, and that tax credit itself is coming to an end here pretty soon.
It will end on September 30th. So this is the one where if you have somebody who has symptoms and they need to quarantine because of that, and even if they don't have leave time through your company policy, that you could still provide it to them, and then get a reimbursement, a $1-for-$1 tax credit to cover the cost of providing that leave. And there's limits on it, but I mean, it's something that's been in place now for well over a year. Actually, I think about a year and a half, because it was in the original Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and then it got extended late last year, one of the final bills that was signed by President Trump. And then it went through September 30th. So that is coming to an end. If your company has been using it, just keep in mind or bear in mind that whatever your company policy was before, and maybe you want to revisit what that policy is, but whatever that policy was before, you'll probably want to return to, given that there's the extension of this benefit was done with a tax credit. That tax credit will be expiring.
One other thing that will be ending, private insurance companies, health insurance companies from early on in the pandemic waived their deductibles for COVID-related expenses. So essentially they paid first dollar, which made it feel like your vaccines and any kind of hospital stay, COVID related, was free. That is ending, as I understand it, for Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, one of the big insurers in our state, ending the end of September.
Yeah, and this was, early on, it was a response, which was just, basically that we've got this big thing coming in. Didn't want anybody to prevent or put off seeking treatment for it, and so if you had a deductible, it didn't apply to like a inpatient, whatever your deductibles were for inpatient or seeking that medical treatment. But that will be coming to an end, and so that, how many? Really, if you get the virus and you get very sick and sick enough to be hospitalized, this will make a difference. So maybe it makes sense to just brush up a little bit on what your regular policy limitations and deductibles are and copays are, because they're going to kick back in here real soon.
Yeah, one of the other things ending is the eviction moratorium.
Yes, the eviction moratorium. So this was a pretty controversial process over the course of the last year and a half, where early stages of the pandemic, there was eviction moratorium that was put into place nationwide. It got extended, and then it got extended, and then it got so. Then the Biden administration had said earlier that they have no intentions on extending it, but there had been an eviction moratorium for so long that they were scared off by the possibility of a bunch of evictions, because people couldn't ever recover from or hope to pay back all that they had owed over that year plus of not paying rent or mortgage. And so what they decided to do was to extend the moratorium. Now, they knew that they could not extend it any further, but they would rather have the Supreme Court overturn their decision and take the responsibility. So they could say, look, we tried. We tried to extend it, couldn't get it past the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that it had to end. What the Supreme Court said was, you could extend it, but you got to get a law passed, right, to do that. So that was not particularly surprising, but it had to go all the way to the Supreme Court to finally reach the conclusion of the eviction moratorium.
All right, a couple of speed round items. We just heard the European Union has added some restrictions for U.S. travelers into Europe.
Yeah, and so this was not a surprise if you were kind of watching the diplomatic arguments between the EU and the U.S. So when the EU opened back up for Americans to come for like non-essential purposes, they're still using that term. So in other words, tourists could go back. Obviously, the tourist industry there wanted that to happen, but what the EU was hoping was that the US would reciprocate and say that the US is now open for non-essential services or traveling to the US from the EU. The United States did not follow suit. Might sound like with the Canadians just recently. So that is I think that part of it is what's happening in America with infections rising and that sort of thing. But I really think that this was a response to the United States not opening its borders to European travelers. So now this is a suggestion. The European Union does it as a suggestion. Each individual country there can still decide whether or not they want to follow it. I wouldn't be surprised, though, if many of them do follow suit, or perhaps add other requirements of, I think they already do actually. Most of them require a vaccination record, but maybe a negative test to go along with it. So those sorts of things might happen, or perhaps an outright ban.
And we heard a clever way for a very large self-insured company to encourage their employees to get a vaccine. It's Delta Airlines using their the amount of premium that is taken out from the employee's paycheck as an incentive.
Yeah, and this was actually I was a little bit surprised when I saw this one. Pretty aggressive move. So what they're doing, as opposed to saying as a condition of employment you must be vaccinated, they're saying, hey, any employee who's using the Delta insurance and they're a self-insured pool, if you're not vaccinated, your premium is $200. The out-of-pocket part of your premium is $200 more per month, and so that based on the article that I read, that since they're self-insured, they went back and they just look at what were the costs of hospitalizations and spread it out, cost per employee, and then said we'd rather, instead of doing that, we're going to bill it just to those unvaccinated because that eliminates hospitalization for the most part. And so, I don't think that that's going to be a very common practice, but it was definitely an aggressive move.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to suggest that it was something that ought to be employed by smaller business. You couldn't really do that anyway, but just another wrinkle in the way employers are trying to encourage or require their employees to get a vaccine. Let's finish with July inflation. The report came out. We're continuing to watch inflation with the concern that it's on the horizon, and it may really be a management challenge for a lot of businesses who haven't had to really deal with inflation in their history.
I think we're gonna talk a lot more about this in the future in terms of what's happening with rising business costs. We're hearing from members about some really dramatic and in some cases crippling rising costs. But the CPI last month was actually moderated quite a bit. So in the previous 2 months, it was much, much higher than what it was anticipated. And so this in July, it was 0.4, which was a lot better. And so, maybe a good sign, but there's still, that just means that it didn't keep on going up. All of those rising costs that have already hit businesses, not like they're going back down. So hopefully they don't go up further, but the feedback that we're getting so far is that month over month, week over week, sometimes day over day, the hits keep on coming with rising costs for small business.
And speaking of the hits keep on coming, it looks like the Hurricane Ida coming up through Louisiana is going to impact oil production from the Gulf, and that's another one of those upward pressures on costs and on the economy. So we'll keep track of that and continue to watch what's happening on the inflation front as we go forward. Thanks for joining us today. Glad to have you along, and appreciate you joining us. We'll be back here on Thursday at 3:00, and we look forward to seeing you then. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. See you on Thursday.